joining me now from Saskatchewan is Ryan Brook. He's an associate professor at the College of Bioresources at the U of S. And Ryan, you research wild hogs. Tell me about this.
Yes, we do. We're an odd bunch. We, as it turns out, we're the only ones to do so. So one of our running jokes is that we say we're going to have a meeting of the national research team for Canada for wild pigs, and my 2 grad students come in my office.
Right. Okay, so you're not a big team, but doing some important work. So first, for those, now I know that there are people in other geographies that struggle with some wild hog populations, but let's talk specifically here in Canada, in Saskatchewan. Where did these wild hogs come from, and how much land do they cover now?
Right. So the story starts in the mid-1980s, and during that time there was a general push to diversify agriculture, and this is when we saw all kinds of new ideas like emu farms and elk ranches and, of course, wild boar farms. And so through the 80s and 90s, the animals were brought over from various places in Europe and Asia to be raised inside a fence as meat, but also to create these high-fence pen shoot operations where hunters can go in and hunt not so much in the wild, but in a relatively easy fashion. And so this all sounded great, and it was going to fill boutique restaurants and create a big Japanese market, and very little of that transpired. And so during that period, a lot of animals escaped. And even by Saskatchewan ministry numbers, they estimate about 3% escape rate per year. And so they've been getting through under over fences. But even worse, what has happened many times, including several recently, is that they cut the fence and let the entire herd go. And in some cases, this is more than 300 animals at a time. And so this is where our source problem comes from. And then, unfortunately, despite what some people have suggested that they will never survive the Saskatchewan winter, these are very large, very hairy animals, and they thrive extremely well. Of course, some of them come from Siberia, so we shouldn't be surprised they can survive, and they've expanded, and they reproduce very, very rapidly. And that's one of the several factors that makes them really, in many ways, the ideal invasive species.
They're also terrifying.
They really are.
They are.
They've got these razor-sharp tusks that can just slash. They are not fearful of people very often, and they can be aggressive for sure. And boy, if you're fair to them now, whatever you do, do not go on YouTube and search the term wild boar charge, because they certainly will charge hunters. If you see 4 animals and you shoot 2 or 3, whatever survives might run away, but they also might come running right at you and try and kill you. So under certain circumstances, they can be aggressive. The biggest animal we've handled in our research program so far is 638 pounds, so pretty close to 300 kilos. So they can be absolutely massive for sure.
So walk me through. So it sort of sets up that, so there wasn't a market, so some people let them go. There was escapes. They've thrived. What does your research look like? Are you just trying to track these? Is there an eradication program? Is there some way to contain this? What are you looking at in your research?
Well, honestly, the first 2 years of our research in 2010 and 2011 was to actually, first of all, we said we want to confirm there are actually wild pigs out there. Certainly for a long time, we felt like we were really studying Sasquatch, and we'd say, oh, yes, we study these wild pigs, and everybody would sort of pat us on the head and say, oh, sure you are, little buddy, of course. And no, many people denied that they even existed. And again, this even in 2010 when I started, people were saying there's no way they would survive, and they're just escapees, and they'll be dead or back inside the fence. Well, that is not the case at all. And so they really have expanded. So we confirmed they were present, and then we confirmed through trail cameras that they were reproducing in the wild, which was another big question. And then we were really kind of hanging on by a thin line. I used some startup money from the University of Saskatchewan, and then I was ready to quit in 2013. There was no interest, no support, no money. It just seemed like this was not an issue anybody cared about. And then it was actually the U.S. Department of Agriculture that saved the day, and they came forward for the last 5 years with really significant not only financial support, but major moral support to say, you guys are on the right track. This is really important stuff. You got to keep doing what you're doing. And so that just exploded our research program. And so my PhD student, Ruth Asham, what she has done, and we just published, was she's made a map of Canada showing not only the current distribution across all of Canada, but also tracking the spread from those early days in 1990 when they were first started to be detected on the landscape up until present, where now, the large majority of the southern half of Saskatchewan has wild pigs wandering around.
So
The other
now,
thing sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so I guess my question is, you know, the USDA wants you to look at this, and we want to know where these hogs are. What do they do that we're worried about? Now, I can guess is an invasive species, and again, they're terrifying, but what damage are they causing?
Certainly, well, they're well known as ecological train wrecks. They graze and browse on vegetation like many other animals, but unlike most animals, they use that nose and they rip up the ground. They're what's called a rooter species, and so they're ripping up the ground, eating roots and grubs and any kind of larvae they can find, and getting food under the ground. So they tear up the landscape and just make a terrible mess. So a group of elk come through and they might graze, some pasture. They might do some crop damage for sure, but pigs will rip up that ground and really cause a lot of destruction. They eat any species at risk, birds, any ground nesting birds or goslings or ducklings, white-tailed deer, fawns. They get into wetlands and they just tear them up. They defecate in them, contaminate them with salmonella and E. coli and all sorts of nasty things. They do tremendous amount of crop damage. They get into agricultural crops and they just devastate them, whether it's peanut farmers in Texas or canola farmers up here in Saskatchewan, and they lay down in these fields for, we've seen easily a week or more. They really, really, really love corn, of course, and so that's their number one choice when available. And they will get inside a field of corn and just start feeding and feeding. And you can drive by that quarter section all summer thinking you have the best growing crop and just seeing it get taller and taller. But you take 20 steps in and there the whole center has been completely flattened and destroyed. So they do a lot of crop damage. And probably our number one thing that really keeps us awake at night is the potential for them to be a disease reservoir, to hold disease or to spread that, and whether that's to domestic hog facilities, grazing cattle, other wildlife, humans, pets, any of those, that's real potential. And so certainly around the world they are very well known for that. And in the U.S. they've pseudorabies, PRRS, PED. Many of the diseases that we worry about on a swine farm are things that we know that wild pigs can carry as well. And so that's by far the thing we know the least about in Saskatchewan is there's been very little testing across Canada, and the only bit that's been done is on a relatively small and concentrated sample in Saskatchewan here, and most of those we have not been able to get anybody to support doing testing for any of the key reportable diseases as well. So when it comes to key disease we really worry about, there has literally been no testing of any kind done in Canada so far.
So now the USDA obviously, I mean, we have a border. It's a line on a map. It sure isn't a physical one, because hey, we're not Mexico. But is the USDA supporting your work because they know full well that these hogs travel and are going to make their way across Canada and down south? Is that where they're trying to manage the risk of these hogs multiplying in Canada and moving south?
Absolutely, and we've been in close contact with Montana for the last, basically a year, because of course Montana's seeing this massive spread in Saskatchewan and saying, "Oh boy, we're wild pig free and want to stay that way." And historically, the concern was pigs coming north from the southern U.S. states. But now their biggest concern by far is that their animals are going to walk across the border from Saskatchewan down into Montana. And those are very valid concerns for sure, because as of right now, Saskatchewan is a very large and highly effective wild pig factory. These animals are having 6 young per litter, multiple litters per year, and they reproduce continuously. So, for example, your elk, deer, moose, all of the big mammals that run around here in Saskatchewan, the native animals, they have about a 2-week period, mid-May to mid-June. We just wrapped up reproduction for all of those animals. But wild pigs, every season of the year, they're having young ones, so they just don't stop. And that's a major factor in why they're so destructive and they're spreading at such a rapid rate. We're seeing them spread at tens of thousands of kilometers per year in the last few years, and now the range is almost 800,000 square kilometers in Canada, and we predict that we'll probably hit 1 million square kilometers, in 2020.
Okay, so now, I mean, no one really wants to talk about an eradication per se, but some, I think, are calling for that. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that we're probably a long way from that. But what is being done to potentially contain this population, or what maybe would you like to see to either contain or decrease this population?
Well, certainly there are some control efforts. So I can't speak for other groups, but I know Alberta, Saskatchewan have some efforts going on for sure. And so in Saskatchewan, they do contract people to trap and kill wild pigs, which is good. But the level of effort and the level of success we're seeing in those programs probably is about equivalent to how many are actually escaping and releasing from wild boar farms. So we're probably at about a push right now, roughly, over the last 10 years on average. I'd say about the amount that have been removed. That might be a little lower even than what are escaped and released. So to say we're making any positive ground would be a major, major reach at this point. We're clearly losing ground. The curve of expansion is literally pointed straight up towards the sky, and so we're seeing exponential growth. And so right now, there is certainly, I've said many times, and I'll say again, that we're well on track to have more wild pigs in Saskatchewan than people. We're somewhere right around 1.1 million people. We have habitat to very, very easily support 1.1 million wild pigs, and with all the agricultural crops, especially, that's a massive subsidy to these animals. And as we speak right now, those pigs are out in these fields, and of course things are just starting to emerge. But you give it the next month and 2 months, those pigs will be putting on massive amount of body condition, feeding on all types of agricultural crops.
And when it's dry, you don't need a pest that large eating what is
Exactly.
growing. Yeah.
For a challenge enough already, for
Well,
sure.
for sure. Now, Ryan, anyone who may want to get in touch with you or might want to let you know where they have seen any of these wild hogs, can they do that on social media, or how does that work?
Absolutely. And well, actually, all you have to do is Google wild pig Canada, and I think the first 30 hits will probably be us, because there really isn't a whole lot else going on. But our Facebook page is called the Canadian Wild Pig Research Project. And you can find us there, and we're putting lots and lots of updates. You can follow me on Twitter, Ryan Brook, and certainly email us wildpig@usask.ca, and we'll gladly take any sightings, any reports. We're asking people if they shoot a pig to save us an ear for genetic analysis, but certainly keeping track of sightings and tracking this spread has been a major factor.
All right. Okay, Ryan, thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
Okay, take care.